In the deepest shadows of the Central Highlands, where ancient forests breathe with the memories of generations, there exist stories that no map has recorded and no textbook has ever dared to capture. They are stories of men who walked into the wilderness, not for glory but for survival, carrying only their instincts, their courage, and the unbreakable bond between human beings and the vast, unending forest. These are the forgotten footsteps of those who searched for ironwood, hunted wild boars, crossed borders without knowing, and lived among mountains and creatures older than any nation. Their tales echo like the heartbeat of the jungle itself. Before we step back into the smoke and fire of the battlefield to relive these unforgettable memories, please take a moment to subscribe and turn on notifications. Your support helps ensure that the sacrifices and the youth of these soldiers are never forgotten. Now let's return to the front lines. He once told me about the countless journeys he made while searching for ironwood, journeys that pushed him to wander for months at a time through forests so vast and silent that a man could disappear into them without a trace. There were expeditions where entire groups from the village traveled together to hunt wild boars, their dogs driving the animals into hidden corners of the jungle where hunters armed with crossbows and spears waited. Drums and wooden gongs echoed from one ridge to another, turning the entire forest into a roaring festival of sound as dozens of people moved like a single body. A single hunt could last as long as 4 days. By the 6th sunrise, according to Sun's calculations, we were already walking on Lao soil without even realizing it. Before we left, Dang reminded everyone to gather more food daily to reduce the strain on the supplies we carried. Hung had shown me how to recognize the wild yam plant. He said it was the best source of food in the forest, rich in starch and safe to eat, unlike cassava, which could make one dizzy if prepared incorrectly. But wild yams dug deep into the ground, making them difficult to harvest. We still had rice left, so we had not yet resorted to digging for them. As for animals and birds, the forest never lacked them. By day, the air around us was filled with the songs of birds. Squirrels darted everywhere, flashes of fur leaping from branch to branch. One morning, as we passed through a sparse section of trees, we saw a herd of wild boars more than a dozen strong rooting in the soil for food. The leader was almost the size of a small cow with long curved tusks glinting at the corners of its mouth. The bristles along its spine stood thick, like the mane of a warhorse. When it sensed us, it stiffened, lowered its head, its eyes sharp and threatening. Then, after snorting several times, it turned and calmly led the entire herd away. Most of the streams in these areas were shallow and ran gently through the valleys where the daughters and wives of the villagers relied on forest life for survival. Hung, like everyone else born in the forest, was tied to it in every way. From boyhood, he had listened to the elders telling stories of the mountains, the rivers, the spirits that lived in the trees. The forest had become his teacher, shaping his instincts, sharpening his senses, and giving him the kind of knowledge no school in the world could ever teach. The old Me woman was the sole healer of her village. From her, Hung had learned countless remedies made from leaves, roots, and bark. In 1963, he joined the army just as his wife gave birth to their first son. His life as a soldier remained intertwined with the forest. The years he spent in his youth wandering in the wilderness had molded him into a scout with iron nerves, a man whose division achieved every victory in mountainous terrain where others would have faltered. These were the things Dang told me about him. Hung himself rarely spoke about who he was. The only time he ever shared anything personal was when he proudly mentioned how his wife had twice taken their child back to visit his hometown. Each time, both sides of his family were so overjoyed they kept mother and child for months, not wanting to let them go. Seeing the brightness on his face as he spoke, I understood how deeply he longed to bring his son home to the place where rice fields rippled like waves, where a small village lay quietly behind green bamboo hedges, where his childhood dreams had begun. That day we walked for a long time without finding a source of water. Dang urged us to move faster, hoping we would reach a stream before nightfall. Walking through layers of dry leaves that crackled beneath our feet, breathing in the scent of wildflowers, I felt a sense of calm spreading over me. Human beings returned to the forest by instinct, as if drawn back to their origins. Standing before the forest's immense beauty, its harsh challenges and its mysterious depths, all the small petty concerns of daily life faded into insignificance. When Dang laughed and clapped his hands, teasing Hung for being philosophical, Hung scratched his head shyly. He never tried to sound wise, he said. He only spoke from what life in the forest had taught him, but his words had weight carved from years of hardship and reflection. Only someone who loved the forest with heart and blood could speak of it that way. Be why the time daylight fully broke. I realized we had spent the entire night sleeping beneath a canopy of ancient ironwood trees. Throughout the morning we continued walking under their enormous crowns. Some of these giants must have been several hundred years old, their branches spreading wide and dense, allowing almost no other plants to grow beneath them. The forest floor was thick with dry leaves. Fallen ironwood fruits cracked open underfoot, scattering countless small, round red seeds that looked like tiny beads. Hung tapped the thick, cracked bark of a massive trunk that would have taken 4 men to encircle. This, he said, was the green ironwood, the king of all trees in the forest. Everyone went silent for a moment as he spoke. I shifted the subject and asked him how he could tell the scent of a tiger in the forest. He chuckled and said that every creature has a distinct smell. Just as at night, even when one cannot see anything, a trained scout can still detect American soldiers lying in ambush simply by their scent. Tigers usually urinate at the base of trees to mark their territory. A hunter only needs a quick breath to know instantly. When I asked how he knew there were 3 tigers, he said one must look at the tracks they leave behind. This, he added, was far more difficult than sensing a smell. Some hunters spent their whole lives failing to master it. A true hunter must listen, observe, think, and accumulate knowledge slowly. Over time, all these impressions seep into the mind until they become instinct. Then a hunter only needs a glance at a footprint or the faint smell lingering in the air to understand whether the animal is full or hungry, whether it is moving alone or with others. The only thing he could not determine from a scent was whether it was male or female. He said he would teach me slowly once we had more time, because such knowledge could not be learned all at once. Dang, walking ahead, called back to reassure me that by the time this journey was over, I would become a true man of the forest. Everyone laughed, and a flock of birds, startled by our voices, burst into the air, flapping loudly. I could never remember when I first fell in love with the mountains. As a child, on clear days, I often climbed the tallest tree in the yard to look toward the Truong Son range, never tiring of the sight of endless blue ridges rising one after another. Perhaps that was why I admired Hung so deeply for his understanding of the forest. As we walked, Dan continued telling stories about Hung, each tale revealing something new about the man. Hung rarely spoke about himself, but what he had shared lingered in my thoughts. He had lived a life shaped by hardship and wilderness, molded by the mountains into someone both quiet and formidable. What struck me most was how his childhood and soldiering years were tied to the same trees, the same mountain winds, the same canopy of stars. Late that afternoon, our group stepped out into a clearing. Dang suddenly stopped and motioned silently for me to come closer. I hurried over, expecting danger, but Dang simply pointed toward a flock of wild jungle fowl pecking at the ground in the distance. He knew I needed to secure food for the coming night and had saved the opportunity for me. Without hesitation, I placed my pack on the ground, studied the direction of the wind by watching the leaves, and moved quietly through the bushes. When I was about 5 or 6 meters away, I knelt, raised my rifle, and aimed. Any closer and the birds might hear me and fly off. Among them was a rooster with pale brown feathers streaked with red and gold, its long tail flowing behind it like a banner. It looked strikingly regal for a wild bird. When the bird fell, I picked it up and noticed that its short, straight beak and uncurved claws made it seem different from an eagle, though at first glance it had reminded me of one. Hung arrived just then. When I asked what kind of bird it was, he laughed and said that in the forest it did not matter what species a bird was. What mattered was whether its meat tasted good. In the evening, we cooked the bird with salt. It tasted delicious, though it had a faint, smoky scent that lingered. Later that night, as we crawled into our shelter to sleep, I asked Hung about the elephants he had mentioned earlier. He said he had been thinking the same thing. Judging by the tracks on the trail, the herd must have used this path many times, not for feeding purposes, because if they had been looking for food, they would have spread out across the forest. Instead, the herd followed a single path. This, he believed, was the trail leading to an elephant graveyard. An elephant graveyard. The words shocked me. Hung explained that he had never seen one himself, but the old villagers spoke often about them. He asked Dang whether he remembered the time they were assigned to a village in the Thay Ket region, a place known for domesticating elephants. Dang nodded immediately. Hung went on, recalling how the villagers made their living by capturing wild elephants, taming them, and selling them to Thailand. Only a few men in each village were skilled enough to train elephants. The rest worked as assistants or trappers. The elders of that village had told him many stories about elephant customs. According to them, large herds often had their own burial grounds high in the mountains. When an elephant grew old and sensed its approaching death, several strong elephants from the herd would escort it to the graveyard. While the old elephant waited for death, the escorts would stay nearby foraging for food and bringing it back. When the old one finally passed away, the herd would cover the body with leaves before returning to the forest. Hearing this, I could not help but imagine whether the path we had followed earlier might be the same sacred route used by a herd on its final journey. Lying in the silence of the night, listening to this strange and touching tale about elephants, I felt an overwhelming desire to see such a place even once. The forest was filled with mysteries that no human being could fully understand. Perhaps that was why it had remained the cradle of life since ancient times. The next morning, as we prepared our gear, Dang asked permission from Second Lieutenant Nguyen, then gathered all 4 of our machetes and disappeared into the forest. Near noon, he returned carrying 2 different blades. He had exchanged them at a nearby Van Q village. These knives, commonly used by the local people, had sturdy wooden handles and thinner but extremely sharp blades with a small hook near the tip. For traveling through dense jungle, they were far more convenient than the heavy engineer's machetes we had brought. That entire day, we focused on completing our preparations. Our departure was set for early the next morning. The lieutenant carefully inspected each man's equipment. He collected the old aerial photographs and maps we had been using and replaced them with new ones, identical but pristine. The route was marked with needle-sized pinpoints so tiny we needed a magnifying lens to see them. Because of the nature of the mission in the harsh Truong Son mountains, all personal items, including letters, photographs, and diaries, had to be left behind. Before packing our gear to store at the station, Son showed me a photograph of his wife and daughter. His wife was a young woman with a gentle oval face, her eyes distant as though she were looking far across the mountains. She held their daughter, a chubby little girl of about 3 years old, who looked full of life and sweetness. That evening, as promised, Second Lieutenant Nguyen joined us for dinner. The soldiers at the station prepared a small but heartfelt farewell meal with a clay jar of Hanoi wine. Everyone raised their cups, wishing for a successful journey. During the meal, we spoke only about family memories and ordinary things. No one mentioned the mission waiting for us the next dawn. The following morning, we set off before sunrise. Mist hung white across the forest, clinging to our clothes and making them wet. The rubber sandals we wore slipped off now and then as we climbed. Around 8 o'clock, the mist had lifted, but the path became steeper. We were ascending the side of a mountain. The feet of the man ahead were nearly level with the head of the man behind. Dang occasionally stopped grasping a branch with one hand while pulling each of us up the near vertical slopes with the other. He told us to conserve our strength for more difficult terrain lay ahead. When I asked why he said that, for the past several days we'd been climbing the spine of the Truong Son range. Only once we crossed to the eastern side would we understand how dangerous the terrain truly was. I sighed and told him that as long as we reached our destination, I did not mind the hardship. Dang laughed and reminded me that reaching the ridge did not mean simply swinging a leg over to the other side like mounting a buffalo. There was still a long way to climb. The sun rose higher, and heat burned the back of our necks as we grabbed branches and roots to pull ourselves uphill section by section. By now, no one had breath left for conversations. Our noses and mouths stung with sweat as each man focused only on the next step, the next grip, the next patch of earth, stable enough to hold our weight. Hung spoke little that morning. When he did, it was to remind us how ancient these mountains were, how many generations of soldiers and travelers had passed over them, how the forest guarded its secrets with both cruelty and tenderness. To survive in such a place, one had to accept every challenge without hesitation. As we climbed, I looked back at the trail behind us. The forest stretched endlessly, layer upon layer of green and shadow. Above it all, the mountains rose like the backbones of sleeping dragons, jagged and eternal. I felt at once small and insignificant, yet deeply connected to every tree, every stone, every breath of wind swirling through the leaves. By midday, we reached a stretch of bare, sunlit rock where we could rest. Everyone dropped to the ground exhausted. Our clothes were soaked and our legs trembled from the steep climb. Hung sat quietly, wiping the sweat from his brow, his eyes drifting toward the horizon where distant ridges faded into pale blue. He seemed to be thinking not of the hardship of the climb, but of something deeper, something tied to his past. The forest, he once said, belonged to no one and yet embraced everyone who walked into it with sincerity. It rewarded courage but punished carelessness. It taught without words and remembered every footprint left upon its soil. Listening to him then in the high silence of the mountains, I understood why he spoke of the forest with such devotion. As we rested on the rocky ledge, the breeze from the mountain ridge cooled our faces. For a long moment, no one spoke. The exhaustion from the climb weighed on our limbs, but the silence carried a calmness that soothed us. Hung finally broke the stillness by recalling how many times he had crossed these mountains throughout his life. He said the Truong Son range had a way of shaping people, chiseling their character with its winds, rains, cliffs, and endless depths. After a short break, we packed up and continued moving. The slope became less severe, though the path twisted like a thin ribbon along the mountain flank. Trees grew denser again, forming a canopy above us that filtered the sunlight into scattered shards. Our boots sank into layers of fallen leaves, and the earthy scent of the forest rose with each step. The afternoon grew hotter. Sweat rolled down our backs, soaking our shirts. Vines hung across the path like living ropes, forcing us to push them aside as we maneuvered through narrow passages. Despite the fatigue, Dang kept encouraging everyone, reminding us that once we reached the next ridge, the worst of the climb would finally be behind us. It was not entirely true, but his words kept our spirits steady. As the shadows lengthened, the sound of a small stream reached our ears. The moment we heard it, our pace quickened. Nothing lifted a soldier's spirits like the promise of fresh water in the forest. When we finally reached it, a narrow ribbon of clear water running over smooth stones, everyone dropped to their knees. We washed our faces, filled our canteens, and soaked our hands and forearms. The coldness revived us instantly. Near the stream stood a patch of tall grass. When we stepped into it, Dang suddenly halted and raised his hand, signaling silence. His eyes scanned the ground. Then he pointed at a set of fresh footprints pressed into the muddy soil. Hung crouched beside him, studying them carefully. After a moment, he said they belonged to a wild deer. Judging by the depth and spacing, the animal had been moving slowly, perhaps searching for water. From the direction of the tracks, it seemed the deer had headed toward the thicker part of the forest. Dang offered to pursue it so we could add more food to our supplies, but Hung shook his head. We had enough for now, and chasing game at dusk risked wasting precious time and energy. With night approaching, it was better to find a suitable place to camp. We walked a little further until we reached an area where the ground was relatively flat. Huge tree roots twisted across the soil like ancient serpents, but there was enough open space for us to set up shelters. Dang assigned tasks. Some gathered dry branches and leaves, others prepared the cooking area, and Hung checked the perimeter for signs of danger. Once everything was ready, we built a small fire and warmed ourselves beside it. The flames cast a soft orange light on our faces as dusk deepened around us. During dinner, everyone ate quietly, savoring the hot food after a long day of climbing. In the glow of the fire, Dang told a story about a time when he and Hung had gotten lost in a bamboo forest for nearly 3 days. He described how thick the bamboo stalks had grown, blocking out nearly all sunlight and making it impossible to see the sky. Hung laughed, admitting he had never felt so disoriented in his life. It reminded us that even the best forest men could be humbled by nature. Later that night, as we settled into our shelters, the forest around us hummed with its usual nighttime chorus. Crickets, distant bird calls, and the soft rustle of leaves created a soothing rhythm. I lay awake for a while, staring at the dim outline of the treetops. My mind drifted back to Hung's stories, to the legends of elephant graveyards, to the countless paths that wound through these mountains long before our footsteps ever touched them. The forest held memories older than any of us. And somehow, as I drifted to sleep, I felt grateful to be walking within its ancient heart. At T-dawn, the forest greeted us with a thin layer of mist, drifting low between the trunks of the trees. Dew clung to the leaves, and when the wind blew, droplets fell onto our shoulders and backs, soaking our shirts once again. We packed our belongings quickly and resumed our journey while the air was still cool. The trail soon narrowed as the forest thickened around us. We moved in single file, stepping over tangled roots and squeezing through dense undergrowth. Hung led the way with steady footsteps, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. Every now and then he paused to examine a broken branch or a faint mark on the ground. Even without words, we knew he was reading the forest the way others read a book. As the morning progressed, the path became steeper once more. We were now approaching a region where the mountain rose sharply and the trees grew taller and darker. The canopy thickened overhead, dimming the sunlight until everything around us seemed wrapped in a soft green twilight. It was the kind of forest where sound travelled strangely, sometimes echoing, sometimes fading instantly, as if absorbed by the trees. Dang called for a short break and we sat down among moss-covered rocks. He pointed out that from here onward the slope would test our endurance. He advised each of us to ration our strength, drink water sparingly, and make sure our packs were secure. The climb ahead was not only steep, but rugged with loose soil and jagged stones that could easily twist an ankle. When we resumed our trek, the forest floor shifted beneath our feet. Dry leaves slid under our boots. Branches creaked overhead. Birds flushed from their perches as we approached, creating bursts of wings and scattered feathers. Sweat trickled into our eyes, stinging them, and our breaths grew heavier. After an exhausting climb, we emerged onto a narrow ridge. From there, the view opened up dramatically. Layer after layer of mountains stretched into the horizon, fading from deep green to pale blue as distance swallowed them. Clouds drifted along the peaks, and sunlight shimmered in scattered patches on the valleys below. It was the kind of sight that reminded us how vast the world was and how small our presence felt within it. Hung stood silently for a long time, taking in the view. To him, these mountains were not only terrain but memories. They held the echoes of his childhood, the footsteps of villagers, the trails of soldiers, and the whispers of the creatures that lived hidden within. He once said that walking the Truong Son range was like walking through time itself. Each ridge carried a story, each stream preserved a memory, and each ancient tree guarded the silence of untold histories. We descended from the ridge, carefully gripping tree trunks to steady ourselves. The descent was almost as difficult as the climb. At several points, the soil crumbled beneath our steps, sending small cascades of dirt sliding down the slope. But by noon we reached a shaded valley where a small stream wound between rocks. The water was cool and tasted faintly of minerals. We refilled our canteens and soaked our faces, letting the coldness wash away some of our fatigue. After resting and sharing a simple meal of rice and salted meat, we continued deeper into the forest. The air grew heavier, filled with the scent of wet leaves and rich earth. Sunlight pierced the canopy in narrow beams, illuminating drifting dust and insects dancing in the air. Somewhere in the distance, a monkey screeched, followed by the rustle of branches as it leapt away. As the afternoon wore on, our path gradually leveled out. The terrain became more forgiving, though still filled with obstacles that demanded constant attention. Fallen logs blocked the way. Vines dangled from branches like living ropes. The sound of insects grew louder, filling the air with a steady hum. Each sound, each movement reminded us that the forest was alive, endlessly shifting and breathing around us. By the time dusk crept in, we had traveled a long distance. Dang signaled for us to stop and set up camp near a cluster of large boulders. The rocks offered some protection from the wind, and the ground there was relatively flat. We gathered wood, built a fire, and began preparing our evening meal. The flames danced in the growing darkness, casting long shadows on the forest floor. That night while we ate, Hung shared memories of his time serving as a scout. He described crossing enemy lines in silence, following trails that only experienced forest men could recognize, and relying on instincts sharpened by years spent wandering under the trees. Listening to him speak, I understood that the forest had been his companion, not only in childhood, but throughout every chapter of his life. After dinner, we lay under the sky, watching the faint outline of stars push through the canopy. The forest whispered softly around us, carrying the scent of damp soil and night flowers. I closed my eyes and let the sounds lull me. With each passing night, I felt the forest sinking deeper into my heart, as if it were becoming part of who I was. We woke before sunrise to the faint glow of morning filtering through the trees. The forest was still dark, but the chill in the air hinted that dawn was nearing. Our clothes were damp with dew, and the fire from the night before had died to a pile of soft ash. Dang urged everyone to pack quickly so we could take advantage of the cooler hours before the heat rose. As we moved, the forest around us slowly brightened. Birds began calling from the treetops. Leaves rustled softly as small creatures stirred. The path ahead wound between massive trunks covered with moss and vines, some so old that their roots curled across the ground like the limbs of ancient giants. The terrain shifted again, The soil became firmer underfoot and the air grew warmer. Sunlight streamed through gaps in the canopy, creating bright patches on the ground that flickered as the branches swayed above. We walked in silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts. Despite the hardships of the previous days, there was a strange sense of peace in moving through a world untouched by roads, machines, or noise. Around mid-morning, the trail took us through a section of forest where the trees grew further apart. Shafts of sunlight pierced the canopy so brightly it felt as though we were walking through a cathedral of light. Hung slowed his pace and looked around. He told us that forests like this were rare places where the trees grew old and proud, untouched by storms or human hands. Such places, he said, held their own spirits. After reaching a small clearing, we decided to rest. The sun had grown strong and sweat soaked through our shirts. Dang checked our supplies and noted that although we had enough food, it was time to start looking for fresh sources. The journey ahead was still long and rationing would be essential. Hung nodded and said the forest would provide if we paid attention. We continued walking until the path sloped gently downward. The air became cooler and the sound of water trickling over rocks reached our ears. A narrow stream appeared between clusters of ferns. We knelt down and splashed our faces, feeling the shock of cold water awaken our tired muscles. Hung pointed out several edible plants growing nearby and gathered a few for later. A little farther along the stream we found traces of animals. Footprints pressed into the mud tufts of fur, caught on low branches and the faint scent of wild creatures drifting in the breeze. Hung examined the tracks carefully. They belonged to a small herd of sambar deer, he said. They had passed by not long ago, likely heading to a feeding area near the deeper parts of the forest. We followed the trail for a short distance until Dang signaled for us to stop. Chasing the herd was unnecessary, he said. We already had enough food and risking energy on uncertain game would only slow us down. Hung agreed. Survival in the forest, he often reminded us, depended on knowing when to conserve strength rather than when to use it. By noon, the heat had grown intense. The forest rang with the sound of cicadas, their shrill chorus echoing from every direction. We found shade beneath a group of tall trees and ate a simple meal. Hung spoke about the way the forest changed with every season, how different species of plants bloomed, how animals migrated, and how even the scent of the wind shifted as time passed. For someone who had spent his whole life with the trees, each detail carried a story. After resting, we resumed our march. The path became uneven, dotted with rocks and roots that threatened to twist our ankles. Dang walked ahead, testing the ground with each step. Several times he warned us to avoid patches where the soil had softened from recent rains. One careless step could send someone sliding down the slope. As the afternoon stretched on, we reached a region where the forest grew darker once again. Thick vines hung like curtains, and the canopy blocked most of the sunlight. The air felt dense, heavy with moisture. Every sound echoed strangely. Hung whispered that we were entering one of the older parts of the forest. He said animals here were more cautious and the trees carried centuries of memory in their rings. Eventually, we arrived at a narrow ledge overlooking a deep ravine. From the bottom rose a cool mist, and we could hear the rumble of a waterfall hidden somewhere beyond the trees. Dang told us we would stop here for the night. The ledge was small but safe, tucked between boulders that shielded us from strong winds. We set our packs down, gathered firewood, and built our camp. When night fell, darkness swallowed the forest quickly. The fire flickered in the wind, casting moving shadows onto the rocks. Hung sat beside the flames, sharpening his knife with quiet strokes. His expression was thoughtful, as if he were remembering something from long ago. After a while he spoke. He told us that in forests like these every sound mattered. A single snapped twig could mean danger. A sudden silence could signal the presence of a predator. Scouts learned to listen, not only with their ears but with their instincts, trusting the subtle warnings the forest offered. As he spoke, the forest around us hummed with life, and I felt a deep sense of connection to everything breathing in the dark. I drifted to sleep with the fire crackling beside us, feeling once again as though the forest was cradling us in its ancient arms. We woke to a grey morning wrapped in mist. Clouds drifted low across the treetops and droplets clung to our clothes the moment we stepped out of our shelters. The forest felt colder at that altitude and the ground beneath our feet was slick with moisture. Dang urged everyone to pack quickly because we had a long descent ahead. As we moved forward, the terrain shifted once again. The ridge narrowed and the path we followed hugged the side of the mountain like a thin thread. To our right, the forest loomed dark and dense. To our left, the slope fell sharply into a deep valley filled with rolling mist. We had to step carefully, gripping tree roots and branches to avoid slipping. Hung walked ahead with confident steps, choosing where to place his feet as though the mountain itself whispered directions to him. From time to time he paused to examine the ground, listening to faint sounds carried by the wind. He seemed to sense things none of us noticed. After a long descent, we reached an area where the trees spread out again. Sunlight broke through the canopy in scattered beams, painting the forest floor with moving patterns of gold. The air grew warmer. We heard birds calling from high branches, and somewhere in the distance, the soft rustle of animals moving through the undergrowth. We stopped by a fallen tree trunk to rest. Dang checked our supplies and noted that we still had enough food for several meals, though fresh water would be crucial. Hung pointed toward a faint trail marked by crushed leaves and broken twigs. A herd of animals had recently passed through, likely heading toward a nearby stream. We followed cautiously, and after some time the sound of flowing water reached us. Soon a clear creek appeared between clusters of rocks, glittering in the afternoon light. We refilled our canteens and washed our faces. The water was icy and refreshing. As we sat near the creek, Hung spoke about how important it was to read the forest correctly. He explained how the calls of birds could reveal the presence of predators, how the scent of leaves changed before a storm, and how the movement of branches sometimes warned of animals long before they appeared. After resting, we continued our journey. The path led us deeper into a region where ancient trees stood like pillars of a forgotten temple. Their trunks were massive, wrapped in thick layers of moss, and their branches arched high above us. The air beneath them felt cooler, filled with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The silence here had a different weight, as if the forest itself was listening. As dusk approached, Dang signaled that it was time to find a place to camp. We moved until we reached a small, flat area surrounded by stone outcrops. The ground was relatively dry, and there was enough space for us to build shelters. We collected dry branches and lit a fire. Flames flickered, casting long shadows across the forest floor. During the meal, Dang mentioned that our journey was nearing the point where the terrain would change again. Beyond the next ridge, the forest would become harsher, the trails sharper, and the weather more unpredictable. Hung nodded. He said the Truong Son range always tested those who crossed it. Every step demanded patience and awareness. Later that night, we sat quietly around the fire. The forest around us came alive with soft sounds, the chirping of insects, the flutter of wings, the distant cry of an owl echoing through the trees. The fire warmed us as darkness closed in on all sides. Hung spoke about the years he had lived among these mountains. He told stories of nights spent alone under the canopy, of watching storms roll across the ridges, of following trails marked only by memory. He spoke of moments when he felt the forest guiding him, helping him choose the safest path. Listening to him, I understood that for Hung the forest was not only a place to survive, but a place to belong. Eventually sleep claimed us one by one. The fire burned low and the forest hummed with its ancient rhythms. Above us, the stars hid behind drifting clouds. The night was deep and quiet, holding us gently as we rested. We rose early the next morning, our bodies heavy from the previous days of climbing and descending. The air was cool, but the sky above the treetops hinted at a clear day. Dang urged everyone to move quickly so we could cover more ground while the weather remained favorable. As we walked, the forest grew quieter. The birdsong that usually greeted the morning felt distant, muffled by the thick canopy. The trees here were older, their trunks wide and gnarled, their branches draped with hanging moss. It was as though we had entered a different realm of the forest, a place where time slowed and the air carried the weight of countless untold stories. Hung walked slightly ahead, moving with a calm assurance. His eyes scanned the surroundings, noting every detail. He paused at one point to examine a fallen branch, its bark freshly stripped away. He said an animal had passed through recently, perhaps a boar or a smaller species that fed on the soft wood beneath the bark. As the path narrowed, we found ourselves walking along a steep mountainside. Loose stones rolled under our feet, and the slightest misstep could send someone sliding down the slope. We held onto tree roots and branches for balance. The air grew warmer and sweat dripped down our faces. Every breath felt heavier. By midday, we reached a small plateau where sunlight broke through the canopy in a brilliant wash of gold. It felt good to stand on level ground again. We set our packs down and rested. Dang checked the map and confirmed that we were making good progress. The most dangerous stretch of the descent lay behind us, though the journey ahead remained long. Hung pointed out several edible plants along the edge of the plateau. He explained how their leaves curled in a specific way when they were safe to eat and how they changed color when touched by insects. His knowledge of the forest felt endless. To him, every plant, every scent, every sound meant something. After eating a small meal, we resumed our journey. The forest opened gradually and the sunlight grew stronger. We soon came across a set of deer tracks embedded in the soil. Hung crouched to examine them. He said they belonged to a young stag likely still traveling with its mother. The tracks led toward a narrow valley where the vegetation grew dense and green. We followed the valley down until we heard the faint sound of rushing water. A stream appeared winding between rocks and ferns. The water was cool and clear, flowing swiftly over smooth stones. We drank deeply and washed our faces. The cold water refreshed us completely. As we rested, Hung told us about different kinds of streams. Some were safe to drink from, others hid dangers such as leeches or stagnant pools. The trick, he said, was to observe the color of the water and the way it moved. Clear, fast water was usually safe, while still water held risks. We traveled farther down the valley until the ground leveled out. The forest became less dense and sunlight streamed through freely. Birds filled the air with their calls again and small animals darted through the underbrush. It felt as though we had emerged from the deep, ancient heart of the mountains into a gentler part of the forest. As evening approached, we searched for a place to camp. Dang found a spot near a group of large, smooth boulders that provided shelter from the wind. We gathered wood for a fire and prepared our meal. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. The flames crackled, casting a warm glow on our faces. Hung spoke quietly as we ate. He reflected on how the forest had shaped every moment of his life. He talked about the years he spent as a scout, the missions he had survived, and the dangers he had faced. He described how the forest protected those who respected it, but punished anyone who moved carelessly within it. Listening to him in the glow of the fire, I felt the depth of his bond with the wilderness. It was not simply knowledge. It was a connection woven through his childhood, his years as a soldier, and the many journeys he had taken through these mountains. By the time we finished eating, the stars had appeared faintly above the treetops. The forest was alive with soft sounds, the hum of insects, the occasional call of a night bird, the rustle of leaves. We settled into our shelters and drifted into sleep, comforted by the warmth of the fire and the quiet presence of the forest around us. We awoke to the crisp morning air, the kind that settles softly on the skin and carries the scent of damp earth. The fire had burned low during the night, leaving behind a faint glow beneath the ashes. Hung stirred the embers with a stick and added a few dry branches until small flames rose again. The warmth spread quickly and we gathered close as we prepared for another day of travel. After a quick meal, we packed our belongings and set off. The forest around us seemed lighter that morning. Sunlight filtered gently through the swaying branches and birds darted overhead in playful arcs. The path sloped gently downward and our steps grew easier. All of us felt grateful for the change after so many days of steep climbs and treacherous descents. As we moved deeper into the forest, we encountered clusters of tall bamboo rising gracefully toward the sky. Their slender trunks shimmered in the sunlight and the wind rustled through them with a soft whisper. Hung stopped beneath one cluster and ran his hand along the smooth surface of a bamboo stalk. He explained that bamboo was both friend and foe in the forest. It offered food, shelter, and tools, but its dense growth could trap even the most experienced travelers. We paused by a clearing where the grass grew tall and wild. Dang knelt down to study a set of tracks printed fresh on the ground. Hung crouched beside him and examined the prints carefully. They belonged to a boar, he said, a large and strong one. The soil was disturbed in several places, suggesting it had been rooting for food, but the boar was long gone, likely frightened away by our approach. We continued moving until the forest thinned and sunlight poured more directly onto the path. The warmth felt good on our backs. For the first time in days, the trail felt less oppressive. Our spirits lifted as we walked together, exchanging light jokes and stories about home. By midday, we reached a ridge overlooking a valley. The view stretched wide before us, waves of green rolling down into the distance. Clouds drifted lazily across the blue sky and the shadows of the mountains fell in long, gentle curves. Dang consulted the map and confirmed that we were on the right track. He pointed toward a distant line of hills and said that once we crossed them, we would begin descending toward the lower slopes of the region. We rested under the shade of a massive tree with roots that twisted across the ground like coiled ropes. The air there was cool and fresh. Hun gathered a few leaves from a nearby shrub and explained how villagers used them to ease stomach aches. He said the forest had remedies for every kind of suffering if one knew where to look. After a short break, we resumed our march. The path curved around the mountainside and the air became cooler again. The sky darkened slightly as clouds gathered above. Hung sniffed the air and said rain might come soon. Dang urged us to move faster so we could find shelter before the weather turned. Not long after the first droplets fell. They were light at first, tapping onto leaves like tiny beads. Then the rain thickened, falling in steady sheets. We covered our packs and continued walking until Dang spotted a large rock outcrop with a dry overhang. We hurried beneath it, grateful for the shelter. From where we stood, the rain poured heavily across the forest, turning the leaves into shimmering curtains. The sound was soothing, a steady roar that echoed across the mountains. We removed our wet shirts and wrung them out, while Hung gathered some dry wood he found beneath the rock shelf. Soon he had built a small fire, its warmth pushing back the chill of the rain. As we waited, the rain softened into a gentle drizzle. Hung began telling us stories about storms he had experienced in the Truong Son range. He spoke of nights when lightning danced across the ridges like silver threads and thunder rolled through the valleys like drums of war. He described how the forest felt alive during storms, every leaf trembling with the breath of the wind. Listening to him, we felt the forest's pulse merging with our own. Even in its harshest moments, the wilderness carried a beauty that touched something deep within us. When the rain finally eased, we resumed our journey. The ground was slick, but the air felt fresher, washed clean by the storm. The scent of wet earth clung to everything. Birds emerged once more, shaking water from their wings. As dusk approached, we found a dry patch near a cluster of trees to make camp. We built a fire and cooked a simple meal. The forest glimmered faintly under the last rays of light. After we finished eating, we sat quietly listening to the chorus of insects rising from every direction. Hung closed his eyes and tilted his head slightly as though listening to a distant memory. Then he said softly that no matter how far he traveled, the forest always felt like home. Its sounds, its scents, its vastness had shaped every part of who he was. We drifted to sleep with those words lingering in our minds, the fire crackling softly beside us, and the great forest standing watch over our rest. We rose before dawn, awakened by the faint chill that always settled over the forest at first light. The sky above the treetops glowed softly, signaling the start of a new day. Birds began to stir, filling the forest with gentle calls. We stretched our tired limbs, warmed ourselves briefly by the fire, and prepared to continue the journey. The trail that morning wound through tall grass and low shrubs. Dew clung to our boots and trousers. The forest grew brighter with each step, sunlight slipping through the leaves in shifting patterns. Hung walked ahead, his posture relaxed but attentive. He paused often to observe the ground or listen to distant sounds carried by the wind. As we moved deeper into the forest, the undergrowth thickened. Branches brushed against our shoulders. Vines tangled around our boots. The air grew warmer, and the scent of damp soil lingered. Dang checked the map, frequently confirming that our path angled toward a wide valley that would eventually lead us down the eastern side of the Truong Son range. Near midday, we reached a clearing where sunlight pooled onto the ground like warm gold. We set our packs down and rested beneath a tall tree. The air was quiet except for the distant sound of a running stream. Hung stood and looked around. He pointed toward a cluster of plants with broad leaves and said they were a sign that water was nearby. Sure enough, after walking a little further, we found a small creek flowing between rocks. We knelt by the water, splashing our faces and refilling our canteens. The coldness revived us instantly. Hung examined the surrounding plants and pointed out which ones could be eaten raw, which needed to be cooked, and which were best avoided. His knowledge felt endless, as if the forest itself had shaped his understanding. After resting, we continued our march. The trail led upward briefly before descending into a long, narrow valley. The trees here were large, their trunks thick and their branches arching high overhead. Sunlight filtered through in thin rays, lighting up the drifting mist that still clung to the lower foliage. As the afternoon wore on, the forest changed once again. The trees grew shorter. The canopy opened wider. Sunlight poured more freely onto the ground. Birds sang louder. The air felt fresher. Hung said this meant we were nearing the lower slopes of the region. The hardest part of the journey was now behind us. But even in this gentler terrain, danger could be found. At one point we came across signs of a recent landslide. Earth and rocks had cascaded down from the hillside, leaving behind a scar in the forest floor. Dang urged us to move carefully. A second slide could happen without warning. We skirted the area and continued along a safer path. By late afternoon we reached a place where the forest thinned dramatically. Sunlight washed over us completely for the first time in days. Ahead of us stretched a wide open area covered in tall grass. Beyond it lay another rise of hills, but nothing as treacherous as what we had already crossed. We stopped to catch our breath and take in the view. Hung stood silently, his gaze fixed on the horizon. His face held a calm expression tinged with something that felt like nostalgia. After a while he said softly that every journey through the Truong Son range left its mark on those who walked it. He said the mountains never let a person pass through unchanged. The forest taught lessons that could not be learned anywhere else. As the sun lowered behind the trees, we began searching for a place to make camp. We found a small sheltered spot near a line of rocks. Dang handed out tasks. Some gathered firewood. Others prepared the cooking area. Hung inspected the surrounding ground for signs of animals. As night settled, we lit a fire and warmed ourselves by the flames. We ate quietly, savoring the warm food after a long day. The forest around us shimmered softly under the fading light. When the last bit of daylight slipped away, Hung began to speak again. He talked about his childhood, how he had grown up hearing stories from his father and grandfather about these mountains. He said those stories had guided him, shaped him, and stayed with him through every trial in life. He spoke of the years he served as a scout, moving silently through enemy lines, relying on the forest to shield him. He told us how even in moments of great danger, the forest gave him strength. He said that as long as he could hear the whisper of leaves or smell the damp earth, he never felt alone. We listened in silence, letting his words settle into the cool night air. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks drifting upward. The forest hummed with its nighttime chorus of insects and distant bird calls. When Hung finished speaking, the forest fell into a peaceful stillness. His final words lingered in the quiet that human beings could leave the forest, but the forest never truly left them. It remained in their memories and their breath, in the way they looked at the world. We went to sleep under the stars, feeling the weight of the journey behind us and the unknown path ahead. The forest watched over us, ancient and vast, as it had watched over countless travelers before. And so our journey continued, carried forward by footsteps upon the earth and the enduring spirit of the mountains.